delighted to be here. And
you know what, sorry, I should have done before. We usually go around the table
Great,
and let
let's do
everybody
that.
tell you who they are.
Perfect.
Not everything that they are, but just enough to whet your appetite. So, we'll start. There you go.
Fred, I'm Joy Vermillion Hindstone. I'm with the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation here in North Carolina.
Great. Thank you.
Tony Brosho with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy.
Joel Huber with the Business School here.
Tom Lambeth, I'm a senior fellow at the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, member of the North Carolina Advisory Board for EDF. And I must tell you, Joel, that Fred's weather control is apparently strategic because it snowed for an hour and a half in Winston-Salem.
And you came anyway, right?
And Richard Schmalbeck, I'm a professor in the law school.
I'm Marty Martin, attorney in private practice and current member of the IRS Advisory Committee for Tax-Exempt and Government Entities.
I'm Jerry McCarthy, visiting from Virginia.
And you were, before you started being a full-time visitor.
Yes, before I became a full-time visitor, I ran the Virginia Environmental Endowment.
I'm Danielle Vance. I'm a PhD student here at Stanford School.
Pete Andrews. I teach environmental policy at UNC and a long-time EDF member.
Hey, Fred. Jim Salzman. I teach law school and the Nicholas School.
Carol.
I'm Daryl Childers. I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy student here at Duke.
I'm Andrew Olson. I'm also a second-year Master of Public Policy student.
I'm Lori O'Keefe. I'm with Triangle Community Foundation.
I'm Sandra Rodriguez. I'm with Triangle Community Foundation, and I just recently joined the North Carolina Advisory Board for EDF.
Andrew Hudson, I work for you.
And thus he's here.
My name is Jake Reeder. I'm a joint degree in the business school and the public policy school.
Rachel Pittenger, second-year Master of Public Policy student.
Elaine Messenger, recent graduate of the Nicholas School and International Development Certificate.
I'm Sandra Duda. I'm with the North Carolina Center for Public Policy Research.
Mary.
Mary Graham. I'm with the Center for Strategic Philanthropy.
Francis.
Francis Letham, Duke Center for International Development.
Bob Walker, I'm with Net Power.
Nora Morse. I'm a dual degree with the School of Public Policy and the School of Environmental Management. Leo, undergraduate student.
Chris Thompson. I'm with the law school.
Christopher Gallick with the Nicholas Institute here at Duke.
Courtney Gaster, undergraduate senior.
Sharon Mountcastle, who's in the Foundation. Nina Schlossberg Landis, involved in environmental policy here in North Carolina, and happy to be on Fred's Environmental Defense Action Fund Board.
In other words, I work for her.
Well, you should add an incentive to tell the truth.
There you go.
Or not. There's no big.
I'm Ann Henshaw, Program Officer with the Oak Foundation, their environment program.
I'm Mary Norris, and I'm Jen Tyer's sister. Just does the regional office.
I'm Pat Ogilvie. I'm Mary Norris's husband.
Yeah. Katie Anderson, second-year Master's student at the Environmental Management Program.
Tom Taylor, I'm an actuary and a long-time member of EDF.
Bill Ross, a visiting professor at the Nicholas School of the Environment.
Mike Vandies, I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student.
I'm Alton Wright, a second-year Master's in Public Policy.
Mark Manshaw, broken record with these two.
Hi, Tom Walsh, also a second-year Master's. I'm Sarah Friedman. I'm a Duke grad student as well.
I think that's everybody. No, it isn't.
Hello, I'm Polly Truax, Program Officer with the Smith Reynolds Foundation.
Great. So, sometimes when weather was overcast and I was feeling a little blue, my mom would say to me, "There's a lot of fish in the sea." And I never really thought about it. Of course, she didn't mean there were a lot of fish in the sea. But actually, Mom, the oceans are in deep trouble. There aren't necessarily a lot of fish in the sea anymore. 2/3 of the oceans are either, fully exploited or declining in population, or have already crashed. And I would ask you, who's catching all these fish? Fishermen. Rhetorical question. You didn't really have to answer that one. The next one you have to answer.
I thought you might be looking for Japanese or something.
Fishermen. So you might think fishermen would be in some ways the least likely people for EDF to partner with to solve this problem. But in fact, that's exactly who the Environmental Defense Fund sought out and recruited to partner with to solve this problem. And together, we've expanded the solution we call catch shares, which means fish populations in the United States are now going back up, which means the number of wasted fish, discarded fish that are thrown overboard dead, has gone way down. And it's better for the fish. It turns out it's better for the fishermen, and it's better for the fishing communities too. And it's just an example of, I guess, two things. One is the textbook environmental problem where too much of something is happening to be sustainable. Too many fish were being taken out of the water for nature to replenish their population. But two, it's an example of an unlikely partnership, some might think unlikely, and that is, as Joel said, what I want to talk to you about today. And I had a lot of fun putting together my notes for this talk because, Joel, you were the first person to ever ask me to talk about almost 30 years now, since I've been at EDF, of the unlikely partnerships that we've been working on. And so I look forward to having a conversation about that. By the way, the Catch Shares work was supported by the Moore Foundation, and Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, to be precise. And without their support of a few other philanthropists, that story, which I'll get into detail about in a little bit, would never have happened. And as a matter of fact, from 1967 until the Ford Foundation made that first grant, which was actually made to the National Audubon Society. Yeah, there was a second grant in your paper number 35 in your series that talks about the first grant to us, but an earlier grant was made through the National Audubon Society, and that was contemporaneous with our friends at NRDC. But we had started 3 years earlier, so we were penniless for a few years. The Environmental Defense Fund is our name, but back then they often referred to themselves as the fundless environmental defenders until the Ford Foundation grant came in.
So why did you change your name from the Environmental Defense Fund to Environmental Defense and then back to the Environmental Defense Fund?
Because sometimes people make mistakes, Joel.
It's like David, did you see the interview David Rubenstein did with Bill Gates? He asked him the question, where did you come up with the idea of getting Control, Alt, Delete? He said, it was a big mistake.
No, it was definitely the name change. It was my idea, and it was one of many mistakes. And we'll catalog them too, along with unlikely partnerships. After that first Ford Foundation grant, many years later, I came to EDF in 1984. So 17 years after EDF was started over the effort to get rid of DDT in our country, which was banned after a 4-year battle, banned by the Environmental Protection Agency, by our friend Bill Ruckelshaus. But when I arrived in 1984, there were a lot of different things happening at the Environmental Defense Fund, a lot of different theories about how to change the world. And one of them was to use markets and to use unlikely partnerships. And so I learned about that as well as the other theories. And ultimately, it seemed to me that it was the idea of using markets and economic incentives and the idea of forming unlikely partnerships was a pretty powerful idea. And we still have lawyers who work with us, and we still file lawsuits. So we haven't renounced the use of litigation to get things done, but it's now a relatively small part of what we do because there's a power of another approach. I wrote about this other approach for the first time in 1986. It took me 2 years to figure out what I was doing, but in the Wall Street Journal. And there I said that long-term solutions lie in finding alternatives to meet the underlying needs. So in other words, people want power, they want water, they want jobs, and we've got to figure out how to have a society that provides all of that while keeping the web of life and our life support systems indeed intact. I also wrote that it's not either or between a healthy environment and a healthy economy. We can have both, and that this new approach can mean new partnerships, even partnerships of former adversaries. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I guess after I wrote that piece, a surprising thing happened to me, which is that at the time, the vice president of our country was George H.W. Bush, and his attorney, with some North Carolina roots himself, Boyd and Gray, called me and said he was very interested in reading this op-ed, and particularly the part that said market-based methods can be used to solve environmental problems. And when the then vice president, ran for president in New Hampshire, he promised to do something about acid rain, to end acid rain in our country. And so George H.W. Bush was elected on that platform. And so after he took the oath of office, or I think after the election and before he took the oath of office, I called Boyden up, now counsel designate to the future president of the United States, and I said, I'd like to come talk to him. And in that conversation, Boyden invited the Environmental Defense Fund to figure out how to solve acid rain using a market-based system. And so EDF, specifically Dan Dudek, who still works with us now, spends his time in China working on their air pollution problems and their emissions of greenhouse gases. Dan Dudek and Joe Goffman, who now works for the EPA, collaborated with a large team of others, including from other groups, and wrote the emissions trading provisions for sulfur dioxide that became part of our Clean Air Act. It was controversial at the time. The idea had gotten some currency because another unlikely set of partners put together at one of our board meetings, Senator Tim Wirth, now head of the United Nations Foundation, then Senator from Colorado, and Senator Jack Hines, the late Senator Jack Hines, then Senator from Pennsylvania. During the election of 1988, or the end of 1987, at one of our board meetings, their wives, who were both members of EDF's board at the time, decided it would be good to have a bipartisan set of ideas put forward about solving environmental problems with market mechanisms. So Project 88 had given this particular idea a platform, and then, thanks to Boyden's invitation, President Bush asked us to to write a plan, which we did, and that plan became law by a vote of 89 to 11 in the Senate, and in the House by a vote of 401 to 21. Those were the days. And we shall return to that sort of bipartisan cooperation. I hope soon nationally, and I certainly hope even sooner here in North Carolina, although I understand that will be a climb. But in any case, in a lot of ways, 1990 and the Clean Air Act was the baptism of the environmental community in market economics. And I think one of the things it taught us at EDF was, while you're seeking to work with the unlikely partners, don't forget about the likely partners. And so we spent time then with the others in the environmental community to talk to them about their concerns about emissions trading, and there were concerns, and the plan got better because of their concerns. We built in more checks and balances to make sure the cuts were really made. But we also learned that we need to talk more about the results that we shared in common with everyone in the environmental community. EDF was promoting a more ambitious cut in sulfur dioxide even than Senator George Mitchell had been promoting. And yet we were being attacked for somehow compromising, even though the result was more ambitious, because the mechanism was so unusual. But we like to talk about the mechanism because it was so unusual, it was novel, and we really should have been talking more about the ambitious result that we aimed to achieve, and that was achieved. This nation has cut its sulfur dioxide emissions, thanks to this program, by, instead of 50% that we aimed for, now well over that, and we will be cutting emissions by over 90% under the new laws that have been passed since. We also, we had it, novel ideas sometimes take a while for people to get used to, so the idea that people could buy a permit to put out sulfur dioxide struck people, a lot of people, as really bad. We were allowing them to pay to pollute. And we didn't explain often enough, well, the cap, the amount that was being allowed, was a declining cap. And yes, you could pay to pollute, but you'd have to pay an awful lot because that cap was going to decline awfully fast. And another thing we ended up figuring out how to explain this is, up until then, nobody had to pay anything to pollute. You just put all the sulfur you want in the air for free. So our system, which had a guaranteed maximum level that would decline over time, was way, way better for the environment. But it took us a while to learn how to communicate that. So anyway, that was maybe one of the first unlikely partnerships EDF participated in. And at the same time, I say that was unlikely because at the time it was very unusual for an environmental group to work with a Republican White House. And that's really unfortunate. And it raised a lot of eyebrows. You can read about those raised eyebrows back on the front page of the Wall Street Journal one day when we had a conversation, when we went in and had the conversation with Boyd and Gray. It was considered, well, why would you do that? But to me, it seems important to talk to whoever holds the office of president, or any senator. We'll talk to them because we welcome their help. And the same thing needs to be true today. So at the same time, I wrote a letter to the president of McDonald's, Michael Quinlan at the time, suggesting that they had a solid waste problem and we could help solve it. And it took a year for us to actually come to terms with McDonald's. They were a little confused that we didn't want to be paid. But that was an important lesson from that partnership, that it's really important for our credibility not to be consultants, paid consultants, but to have arm's length, independence. So we learned to communicate about that, and proudly boasted that we hadn't accepted even one free hamburger. Of course, some people didn't think that was that. Well, anyway, I like McDonald's food. I want to say that for the record. This was an extremely unusual partnership at the time in 1990. The nation really has come a long way. It made enormous headlines when we agreed to work with them, enormous headlines when they agreed to stop using the styrofoam clamshell, and that was just one of 44 things they agreed to do. They cut their waste stream dramatically by 30 or 40% by adopting all these recommendations. And the editorial praise was overwhelming. The New York Times wrote, "McDonald's and the Environmental Defense Fund bet heavily on cooperation, and so far everyone is winning," on their editorial page. The Atlanta Constitution wrote, "Environmental groups have gained enough sophistication and political strength to work with industry without losing their souls. If McDonald's has set a good example, so has EDF." And Chicago Tribune, the Boston Globe, and on and on. I don't want to read all of them because it's uncomfortable, but I think it's worth remembering because it was very unusual, and in a way it still is unusual. So if we fast forward to the Washington Post's editorial board, within the last few months, they talked about our partnership with Governor Hickenlooper and 3 oil companies on the subject of reducing methane leakage, and they wrote, "Mr. Hickenlooper hashed out the requirements with drillers in the Environmental Defense Fund, an activist group whose practical approach has done much more to clean up fracking than the unsparing opposition of its more radical cousins." I don't actually agree with that, but because I think that there's a lot of different useful roles in the environmental community, and for people victimized by living near fracking sites that haven't been well operated, I'm happy that their concerns have been given voice by some of my brethren in the environmental community. At the same time, I read it because, like the earlier quotes from 20 years ago, 25 years ago almost, they speak to a kind of hunger that professional observers have had for problem-solving approach, for unlikely allies to get together. To me, while there's a time for lawsuits and pointing out gross abuses to the environment and who's responsible, there has been way too few attempts to sit down and talk to people who, when you do sit down and you talk to them, not every time can you solve the problem, but if we try it so infrequently as we have, you're leaving a lot of gains on the table, because in conversation can come a lot of solutions. Not every problem can be solved like this. So I should say the acid rain work, Project 88 specifically, that gave credibility to emissions trading was supported by the Carnegie Corporation, by the R.K. Mellon Foundation, among others. And the money was actually given to the Environmental Policy Institute, although the project was run by Rob Stavens with a whole lot of input from EDF. And I'm trying to remember, why was the money given to the Environmental Policy Institute? I think because the approach, even internally within EDF at the time, was still a little controversial. The McDonald's work didn't have a funder. We kind of seeded that ourselves through our unrestricted grants of our members. But then by 1994, after we'd had success with McDonald's, the Pew Charitable Trust decided, hey, this was an interesting approach, and they would like to help it along, and they'd like to be associated with it too. And so they funded in Boston a incubator for corporate partnerships, and that still exists today within EDF. Our corporate partnerships project today that's run by Tom Murray, and I think it was a good thing that when we think about nonprofit entrepreneurship, that EDF in its garage with its own assets started something, proof of concept, and then a major foundation came in. After a few years, I think the Pew Foundation was very pleased with the results, but I think it's fair to say wanted it to be more of a Pew thing, and they thought it was more of an EDF thing, and we couldn't strike the right balance, so we continued it even after Pew withdrew the extraordinarily helpful support that they gave us. Starting in 1995, we began working on a whole series of projects involving working lands. Privately owned lands. A lot of our country isn't privately owned. I live in Connecticut. Over 95% of the state is owned by private landowners. Texas, I think the number is 97% of the state. I don't know what maybe somebody here knows the percentage in North Carolina. Sorry?
Around 90.
Around 90. So if you're going to have a working web of life, how can you possibly do that without private landowners doing their part? Now, if anybody here thinks you can regulate private landowners into doing all the things necessary to keep that web of life going, I want you to explain to me how. So our approach has been to come up with a whole series of incentives, not tax incentives, but other sorts of incentives that make it in people's interest to do the right things to protect rare endangered critters. That's our Safe Harbor program that started right here in North Carolina. And we've worked with landowners and farmers on water, conserving water, and also we continue to work on fertilizer issues, like getting farmers to use less fertilizers. Partnerships make it in their interest to do so, and we're working on a new set of ideas called habitat exchanges, so that if something's going to be developed, you end up the day having that development be better for the critters than before it started. So it might not be better in the exact same place, but by scientific criteria, there overall is net benefit. Habitat exchanges. And that sort of work has been supported by the Packard Foundation, again by the Moore Foundation, and others. I said before that I was going to talk a little bit about cat shares, and which I opened with such a great story, and I think it was one day in Florida, Joel, when I told you that story that you invited me to come here today.
It was the tipping point.
It was the tipping point. There you go. The cat shares basically gives fishermen a stake in the future of that fishery. And by stake, I mean stock certificate, ownership interest. And so up until when they get that stake, we've had enormous controversy about fisheries, how they should be regulated. The government's approach, instead of giving people a stock certificate, has been to command and control the fishery. So as the fish dwindle, first you can fish for halibut off the Alaskan coast for 8 months, 9 months, and then 6 months, and then 3 months, and then 2 months, and by the time they ended fishing for halibut using the command and control technique, the season lasted 48 hours. And it was pretty awful, because what happened is, no matter what command and control regulation you came up with, basically the fishermen were clever and they were just making a living and they'd find a way around it. So basically all the boats would go out in that 48 hours, no matter what the weather was. There could be stormy, it could be terrible. And we would lose several fishermen, 4 or 5 every year, due to this crazy mad derby in the last few years, such a confined season. One poor fisherman, rushing, he got a big halibut on his boat and was flopping around. They can cut you, they can kill you with their tail if they sever the wrong artery on your body. And so he had to put the halibut down, kill it as fast as possible. And he took his pistol out and he shot it dead. Forgetting it was on a boat, he shot a hole through the bottom of the boat and the fisherman perished. But that's the sort of rush that they were in. People would lose limbs. And the crime of it was the halibut would come on shore. There was a glut of it. So the fish processors were able to, they were the only people that could possibly cut it up in time, so they could pay pennies a pound for the halibut. The fishermen weren't making much money. The fish would all have to be frozen, because nobody could eat that much fresh halibut, a whole year's catch in 2 days. By the time it was frozen, the quality was worse, so it would be sold not as halibut, a high-quality fish, but as generic fish sticks. So this was lose, 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 until the idea of catch shares, which I want to be clear, EDF did not invent this. We found it elsewhere in the world. But, and it was adopted in Alaska before EDF was promoting the idea, so we're not even responsible for its creation there. But when catch shares was adopted in Alaska, suddenly the fishermen could have year-round fishing. There were systems put in place to make sure there was compliance, that the quotas weren't exceeded. High-quality fish could be sold for much higher return for the fishermen. The mortality rate in the fishery dropped to near zero. It's a rare year now when any fisherman is killed fishing for halibut. So pretty much everybody, makes out a lot better, including fishery. Fishery after fishery in America are now coming back. Congress banned the use of this tool, and then with the cooperation of former President George W. Bush, who had helped us when he was governor of Texas in supporting lifting the congressional ban on this idea. When he was president, the ban was lifted, and with the support of the Walton Family Foundation and, again, the Moore Foundation, this has now become the way more than 2/3 of the fisheries in the United States are managed. It used to be, when EDF started, it was halibut and 4 other fisheries. Now it's more than 2/3 of all the fish caught in the United States are caught under these systems, and the fishermen love it. And the last thing I'll say about catch shares is it really was brought home to me. In California, EDF had worked with the Nature Conservancy and other good partners to create marine protected areas. And the fishermen would fight those, because to them, before catch shares, a marine protected area meant a set-aside zone where they couldn't fish. A couple of years ago, catch shares went into place for 90 species of ground fish in California. and a bunch of fishermen came to our board meeting to say that they had fought the idea, they had litigated it against the idea, and they were so thankful that they had lost. But I don't know if it really registered in me until I heard a few months ago that the fishermen feel it's so urgent to set aside the spawning areas of these groundfish that they can't wait for government to do it. They've signed private agreements with each other not to fish in the spawning grounds. Why? Because suddenly they have a stake in the recovery. And so the fish are recovering, the waste catches are diminishing. That's a little bit about catch shares. 2010, one of the most unlikely partnerships EDF was involved in that hasn't borne fruit. Another, I'm not going to call this a mistake, Joel, because I think it was very successful, but not successful in terms of the result. How can that be? We worked with GE, Jeff Immo, at the time with many in the oil industry and the utility industry to put together something called USCAP, United States Climate Action Partnership, which was a series of companies, even some in the mining business, car industry, calling on government, the federal government, to regulate and control its emissions of greenhouse gases. It was enough to get a majority. It helped convince a majority of Americans that there should be a federal law to reduce greenhouse gases. It was enough to win adoption of a bill called the Waxman-Markey bill in the Congress, in the House of Representatives. It had the support of the President of the United States, but we never got it passed through the Senate, and it was dropped without a vote. So it wasn't a successful partnership, but I think there was an incredibly important lesson there that, you know, if you can get people to agree on a problem and co-design a solution that would have worked for the environment, that is something that's going to get a lot of attention. I mean, I think it was strategic realism that EDF and NRDC and National Wildlife Federation and other groups were involved in this too, for us to put this together, even though ultimately the 2008 recession, the President's priority of health care, got in the way of actually having that get adopted. We have a whole series of other partnerships going on still. I think one of the most exciting ones is with, on the issue of natural gas, where it's a very controversial issue. There are people who have been affected, by having these wells next door. I got involved when the President asked former Secretary of Energy Chu to put together a commission to chart a safe path forward for the country to take advantage of its shale gas resources. And I learned two things were true. One, in my opinion, while fracking, hydraulic fracturing or fracking, is not appropriate for every place, you're not going to have a pristine area after you industrialize it by bringing wells in. So certain places should be off limits. Where you are going to allow the drilling, it's really important that safeguards and protections be put in place. I came to the conclusion that you could you couldn't leave an area pristine if you were going to do it, so in certain national parks and treasured areas, you shouldn't do it. In certain places where the shale is too close to the surface, it's too dangerous and risky, in my view, you shouldn't do it. But in a lot of places where it is going to be allowed, there is a safe path forward. That was the first conclusion I reached. Second conclusion I reached is just because there's a safe path forward in theory doesn't mean that here on Earth we're going to be able to create it. And so EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund, with support from the Bloomberg Foundation and the Robertson Foundation and a whole lot of individual philanthropists like Stan Druckenmiller and others, have supported our work to both protect the local citizens from the danger of contaminated water, which doesn't so much come from fracturing shale, but does come from the development of shale resources if the well shaft isn't cemented properly or if there's a spill of chemicals on the surface. They've supported our work to protect the citizens from the local effect and also supported our work to protect the atmosphere from the very harmful effects of methane escaping anywhere in the natural gas system. That's just not just from fracturing jobs, but from pipes or distribution pipes. Methane going into the atmosphere, the instant it leaves a well or a pipe, is 120 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And over 20 years, the next 20 years, we're going to see it's 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide, pound for pound. And so you can erase the advantage that natural gas has from a climate perspective. Natural gas always going to have an advantage over coal in terms of there's no mercury, no particulates, no sulfur. But in terms of the climate advantage, we had been thinking natural gas was about half the pollution as coal. But you can erase that advantage if just 2% of the product, 2.7% is the latest number, leaks from the natural gas system into the air. And so EDF has been working on that for the last 3 years with the support of the philanthropists I mentioned. And I might just close before we open this up for questions by saying in the last couple of months we've had some real breakthroughs. The first breakthrough has been an unlikely partnership in that 3 of the biggest drilling companies in Colorado, actually the 3 biggest, Noble Energy, Anadarko, and Encana, were asked by the centrist governor John Hickenlooper, to get together with the Environmental Defense Fund and figure out how can you effectively reduce methane leaks from in the field. And he had said about 18 months ago he wanted to have zero tolerance for these escapees. Put them back in jail. No, put them back in the pipe. And so in September he asked us to get together, and by November, after a lot of tense conversations, full-day conversations, we agreed on a proposal that would reduce emissions of volatile organics from these well fields by 50%. In other words, by 100,000 tons a year, as much as come out of all the automobiles in Colorado in a year. That's significant because in Colorado they really cleaned up their brown cloud over Denver, their smog, but with all the wells being punched and the fumes coming out of them, that progress had eroded and the brown cloud was getting worse and worse. But in addition to that 100,000 tons a year, another 100,000, round numbers, of methane, not a volatile organic, but a greenhouse gas, will also be reduced. It's about roughly a third of all the methane being reduced in the fields in Colorado. So, and natural gas, by the way, is one of the 2 biggest sources of methane, man-made methane releases in the country. 1/3 of natural gas is from natural sources, then twice as much of that comes from man-made sources. So we were really happy that 2 weeks ago, well now actually a month ago I have to say, time keeps marching on, a relevant commission in Colorado approved this regulation, strong regulation, the first regulation anywhere in the country at the state or federal level to directly regulate methane, because it doesn't have big local effects. It has some local effects. It does add to the brown cloud, but not as much as the volatile organics. First regulation anywhere in the country was approved by an 8-to-1 vote in Colorado a few weeks ago. And then the second breakthrough we had was a week later, a report we commissioned by the consulting firm ICF, using industry data, concluded that natural gas, which costs, the average cost in the last year has been about $4 for 1,000 cubic feet. To heat my home in Connecticut cost $120 1 month this winter. For just 1 penny per 1,000 cubic feet, we could implement 19 different control strategies that would reduce the emissions of methane from American natural gas operations, not only in the field but all through the system, by 40%. So in other words, on a base price of $4, my bill had been $120 month of November. And all of this cost was incremental to me, which I'm not sure it would all be passed through, but let's assume it would be. My bill would have been $120.30. My math is right. We'd get a 40% reduction. About 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas could be kept in the pipeline. And a precious American asset and a powerful greenhouse gas. It seems like the natural gas industry should come out today. I haven't looked at my iPhone, but I'm hoping, seriously hoping, that many in the industry see that this is something that they really can and should do. So let me close by saying that initial Ford Foundation grant that Joel referred to, that helped take us from penniless funders, defenders of the environment, to our road to today, they were taking a risk. And, you know, to me, I'm really happy when philanthropists don't take risks. Like on cat shares, once we have proof of concept, we still need a lot of support in order to do what we did and take a proven idea to the whole country. That's expensive. So when philanthropists support a proven idea, I think that's great. But, you know, when philanthropists are willing to take risks, I'm grateful for that too. Because this idea of unlikely partnerships, or back in the day that the Ford Foundation supported us, the idea was marrying science and law, the initial idea of EDF. It was a pretty new approach, and thank goodness that they took a bet on us, and over the years people have taken a bet on these partnerships. Because I think, just as there's, you know, drugs in the pipeline today that hopefully will be the cure for some diseases that we may need those drugs from, I know that it's just as likely that whether we're talking about environmental problems or a whole lot of other social policy problems, that we need some innovative new approaches. And so I applaud those in the philanthropic community who also are willing to take a risk. To borrow a phrase from you, Joel, this could be the next great American secret that truly changes the world. So I'll end there, and I hope, though, that somebody's got a question. I'm told that you're a very shy group.
I told you that. Thank you, that was really wonderful. You have your finger up.
Oh, thanks, Joel. Fred, thanks so much for coming in. So I want to ask about innovation and policy innovation. And as you said, but I think you were even so modest about it, about how innovative EDF has been, and especially under your leadership, in initiatives like emissions trading and catch shares and working with corporations or unlikely partnerships. I remember sitting with you having pizza at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, and your phone rang, and it was the first time that I had seen someone with a handheld cell phone receive an international phone call. We didn't have those in the government yet, but you did. So, so you've been innovative in so many ways, and what I want to ask is sort of two parts. One is, what do you think is the culture of the organization? What have you worked on to make EDF so innovative or so receptive to and ambitious for innovations when many other environmental groups have not been, or many other groups on any kind of issue have not been? And as you said, sometimes EDF got attacked for putting its foot out in front on some of those kinds of innovations, and so there's been a significant cost sometimes, but nevertheless you've kept at it. So what's, strategically or culturally, what's been what have been important for you? And the second part is, looking ahead, what do you think is the next new thing that in that series of policy innovations that you've worked on? Is EDF have something that you're working on now that you can tell us about?
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, innovation is one of our, core cultural elements: optimism, integrity, respect for others, and innovation. And we do all we can to preserve those core values. We hand them out to new employees. We talk about them. We have meetings about those core values. So Bob Doran, who founded Wellington Management up in Boston, asked me one day about 20 years ago, do you think the culture of EDF is important? It's like a trick question. I said, yes. And then he asked, what are you doing to preserve it? And I said, and he pulled out his brochure of the core values of Wellington Management. That's when we decided, we should put a little more effort into preserving the culture. So we do work on that. I would say more than that, Jonathan. I like to think that EDF is kind of a meritocracy of ideas. And when I have a bad idea, which happens 2 or 3 times a day, it doesn't matter who it is in the organization. Someone who's just been working there for a few months, they'll take me on and explain, have you considered that? And I'd like to think I am, and we have a culture that's open to really thinking things through, so we get to ideas that are more likely to work. Having said that, I think you're downplaying the merits of other environmental groups. I think there's a lot of other environmental groups that are innovative. I may know less about them because I've got my hands full knowing what EDF does. But the one thing we can say about every environmentalist that I have ever met is they care about results. And even as some of our new ideas haven't been accepted by other groups, or maybe as some of their new ideas haven't been accepted by us, when an idea works, it spreads within the environmental community. So emissions trading on acid rain was vilified by some of my brethren, but virtually every environmental group, not quite everyone, virtually every environmental group supported it as part of Waxman work. So we have to say that. The next new idea, who knows? I think we're in in the midst of an information revolution, and sensors are becoming ubiquitous and low cost. So, my own view is that I spent time talking about the methane problem. I could have just as easily talked about our work with Walmart to get rid of toxic chemicals in products, something that Andrew Hudson has been working on. It's becoming so easy for all of us to find out what chemicals are in our bloodstreams and in our bodies. People are going to become so sensitized to the fact that methane is being released by pipes, that transparency that's provided by ubiquitous, low-cost sensing and having that information posted on the web is going to be something that by democratizing information, it will create its own form of powerful market incentive for people to do better. And so I think that's another thing that we need to exploit, and I give credit for first opening me up to the possibilities of that to Joel and I have a mutual friend and former EDF employee, David Rowe, who really pioneered that idea for EDF years ago, and I think we're still working on that one.
So Fred, you talked about sort of, I guess, unlikely, unnatural, or whatever you want to call it, partnerships that succeeded even if they didn't lead to the result you wanted. I'd be grateful if you could talk about some that didn't succeed, either that folks came to you and you said, that's not for us, or you started and then said, this isn't going the way we want. Is that quite unusual? I don't care about particular names, but I'm curious about some of the dynamics you faced.
Yeah, we try things that don't work all the time, and we try to learn from that. In Silicon Valley, if somebody's had a few failures, that's considered a plus on their resume, because hopefully they've learned from that. I suppose it depends who they are and how much they've learned, but so we've had a project that we tried to get a group of companies to support a particular thing, and it was we learned it was really hard to get a whole group of companies to support the same thing, and it didn't work as well as we would have liked. And so for a long time we tried, okay, we're going to try to get an industry leader to do the right thing. That's easier. And then hopefully the process of imitation will spread it, especially if we pick the right successful leader. Another thing we learned is don't partner with a company that you haven't had contact with the CEO. We had one experience, and I'm not going to name names, but where the president of the company found out that we were working on a project to increase the recycling in paper. And when this person got the first call from one of his clients that happened to be in the timber business, that was the first he'd ever heard about the partnership with EDF and a group of companies, and he pulled his company out, that afternoon. Well, shame on us, we hadn't made sure that the CEO understood the risks, that it might irritate some folks, and if he wasn't prepared to shoulder the burden of having that phone call come in, we had been wasting our time. We sunk time into a relationship that didn't pay off. So now we're careful. It's not always me who meets with the CEO, but somebody who at least verifies that the CEO is aware of anything significant that we're going to do with it.
This is very inspiring. One of the hardest things for any company to do is to partner with anyone. And looking at what you do, you don't just partner with corporations, but you're working with governments. You're on your knees to foundations, and then you have your members. And so my question sort of has to do with the other side of Jonathan's question about innovation is, how do you ever decide where you're going to do anything? Since you don't have anything to do it with, you just have to get people together. So how do you keep that ball moving?
Well, the first thing is...
I just find you a remarkable corporation.
We try to work on the world's biggest problems that are tractable. So it's the intersection of really big things that are tractable. And we go through a pretty detailed analysis of, before we'll get involved in something, what are the chances of success, but also, if we do succeed, does that make a difference at a scale that's meaningful? But then after you decide you want to do something big and important, that's the easy part, then it's a series of judgments. And we're always looking to hire people with great judgment. So one thing about having great judgment and being open to partnering with folks is, if you have an attitude that business is evil or wealth is bad, companies are polluters, there may be reasons you think that, but if you come to EDF with a chip on your shoulder, we don't really want to hire you. We're looking for people who understand that, yes, companies do things that have negative side effects, but it's not because they're evil people. It's because that's the rules in our economy, and you can't work with every company. Every company doesn't have a culture that wants to be partners with an environmental group, but sometimes you can and create a good example, and sometimes those good examples can create good laws, and they can capture those who maybe would never be captured by a partnership.
Fred, I'm interested in how you think about and deal with the chip on the other shoulder as well, which is that, for example, Indiana's legislature just trying to sweep away their environmental, energy efficiency and renewable energy standards entirely, and an effort which barely failed in North Carolina last year to do the same. The idea that we've got a huge growing clean tech industry in this state right around us here, and yet we had 3 legislators come to a big conference in the mall and basically blow it off, and anything that's green must be sort of left-wing tree huggers, rather than the kind of values and approach that you're espousing. I'm interested in how you meet that, and what more can be done to sort of get past the stereotypes on both sides.
Well, you really raise the question of politics and our political gulf that divides our country on so many issues, the environment being one of them. And to me, Pete, there's a lot of things that have to happen, and one of the things that has to happen is the environmental community needs a lot more clout at the ballot box. We need to have people who care about the environment deciding who they're going to vote on the basis of these issues, and that will motivate Democrats and Republicans and independents to be more likely to take a positive stand on environmental issues, just as when members of the Latino Hispanic community exercise their views at the ballot box on politicians' views of immigration, it makes it more likely for more politicians of all stripes to support immigration reform. And we haven't, in the environmental community, had enough clout. So I'm happy to see EDF has created its own PAC, and other environmental groups have done the same. The League of Conservation Voters raised a lot more money in the last cycle than ever before. So different groups with different of different stripes are now getting into the political game in a bigger way, and I think that's one of the ways you address that. A second, but part of that has to be supporting Republicans and building relationships with Republicans, because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy if environmental groups don't praise Republicans who do good things. Then I've been told by senators and presidents, why should I do that? Because I'll never get praised anyway. And I remember when George W. Bush, who was no ally on climate change, but who did great things on cleaning up diesel engines, when EPA was doing one of those great things on cleaning diesel engines, I was going to a press conference to praise him. And I took phone calls from some folks saying, well, why are you doing that? I wasn't praising the administration, but I was praising the president and head of EPA for doing the right thing on diesel engines, and that's the way my mom taught me. And I think it's a pretty basic rule. If you ask somebody to do something, they say yes, you say thank you. So I believe the environmental community's got to have a lot more clout at the ballot box, but part of that is going to be developing relationships, including supporting Republicans who are good on these issues, and there are a lot of Republicans who are, and specifically on the climate change issue. While I remember when some of the tobacco scientists were saying that smoking didn't cause lung cancer, and it was important for it to be pointed out that a lot of them were in the employ of tobacco companies. I think it is important on the climate change issue for us to point it out when scientists are spread misinformation about climate change. At the same time, a lot of Americans are busy making a living, making ends meet. They hear a lot of confusing things. And when somebody comes up to me and says they're not so sure about climate change, I don't get into a big argument about, you have to believe me. I ask them, do you buy fire insurance on your house if they own a house? Or car insurance on their car if they own a car? You don't buy it because you think your house is going to burn down. But just ask people if they think the risk is big enough. Don't force their nose into the ground that they have to be a believer. Just, do you think there's enough science that this is a risk that we should go out and buy insurance? And if the answer is yes, the way you buy insurance on climate change is you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because you don't want the future to be at risk. So I think there are things we need to learn in the environmental community about treating others with respect, others who aren't paid by the Koch brothers, but who are just genuinely confused. And that's how I deal with that.
Rich?
So I'm not an antitrust lawyer, but it does strike me that in at least some of the circumstances you've described, there may be a fine line between partnering and conspiracy and restraint of trade. And I wonder if is that a major thing that's on your radar screen, or have you just not had much trouble with that because of the overall beneficial and obviously beneficial aspects of fishermen?
There are times when we bring groups of companies together that we're aware that there's certain things that we can talk about or that they can talk about, and there's other things that would be inappropriate. So it's on my radar screen. But there's also, I think when we're talking about government policy, my understanding is there's lots of ways that we can get groups of folks, including groups of company, together to be constructive participants in suggesting policy ideas that are more likely to be effective than others.
and there aren't any unhappy stories where you've had to answer Justice Department inquiries or anything like that?
Not yet, but we try to be aware of the restrictions and live by them.
Mary?
I want to get back to the politics. My two questions. Is EDF doing anything to sort of build the pipeline through your membership or partnering with others to really build the pipeline of environmental people who can go on to be elected leaders, and thinking about sort of developing that pipeline of committed, trained, good leaders? And secondly, through your PAC, are you supporting moderate Republicans in the primary process? Because I think that's so often where the Tea Party comes in and we get such radically right-wing people that come out of the primary. It seems to me that's a really, I agree with you completely about supporting people on both sides who are thoughtful and approach something to be problem solvers, but it kind of has to be in the primary process.
Yeah, on the political question, I'll refer you to Elizabeth Thompson, the head of our Environmental Defense Action Fund. I think the answer for this cycle, Mary, is no, we haven't found races like that to support, but yes, we are likely to support a bunch of Republicans in general elections, and she will have more of the details. As Nina might on your left, who's on our board, on that board, I wasn't accusing you of being a Republican, though.
I think everybody here knows better.
As to the first question, we have a pretty extensive internship program, and one that we want to even add more structure and mentoring to. But we take every year more than 100 interns into our offices around the country. Beyond that, we have a second program, which in some ways you can think of a little bit like Teach for America, which is called Climate Corps. And this is another 120 interns. And the beauty of Climate Corps is they go into companies, AT&T, IBM, Cisco, and on, and find carbon savings that are possible. These interns in more than 100 companies in the last 4 years have found $1.2 billion net present value savings. 86% of their ideas have been implemented by the companies they've worked for. The companies pay their salaries, but we pay the cost of training them. We've begun to think, since Teach for America was much earlier and has many more students than we have, we're constantly catching up. I would love to be thought of as constantly catching up with them anyway. That one of the main benefits of Teach for America, not by any means the only one, but a big benefit of Teach for America, is they're building a whole cadre of kids who know about education and going on to leadership positions and becoming superintendents of schools. I think there's a case now where even that's happened. We think of Climate Corps in the same way. We're creating a network of leaders within the corporate sector, some of whom end up in the nonprofit sector as well, that have been trained on the climate issue. So that's a very deliberate, structured program, and the rest of our internships we're looking to make even more impactful.
In the back.
So I want to go back to your previous comments about wanting to keep McDonald's a little bit arm's length to preserve impartiality and at least perceived, and then the comment about the tobacco scientists.
The comment about the lack of
tobacco.
Yeah.
Given that resources are not infinite, if there were to be a corporate partner to come to you to say, I want to expand work in X, Y, or Z area, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how, given the landscape of potentially declining federal grants and challenges for fundraising and other spheres, what are your thoughts on how best to engage corporate partners, especially if the transformation we've been talking about these partnerships increasing, if that is really to take off? How does one take advantage of those opportunities while preserving that impartiality?
Well, that's a good question, and a lot of people find EDF's approach counterintuitive, that we should be taking money from companies because that would allow a lot more of this work. And reasonable people can have different opinions about that. I should make clear, too, that while we don't take money from the companies, we do take money from individuals, including individuals that own stock in companies. If you were to write a check to me and it turns out that you're a big stockholder in a company that we partner with, I wouldn't know that. But even if I did know that, our rules would allow us to take money from individual philanthropists, not from corporate-controlled foundations, but yes, from family foundations.
Like the Walton Foundation?
The Walton Family Foundation is a major supporter of ours for several of our projects, and we work with Walmart. So that's a good example. So having said that, I think there's ways for our study of how much methane is leaking. Nobody knew how much methane is leaking from the natural gas system. We raised about $10 million, but we allowed companies that were part of the scientific studies, contributed money to the University of Texas or others that was publicly disclosed to support that research. The Climate Corps fellows, as I said earlier, they're not paid by EDF, their salaries are paid by the companies. So I think there's ways that an environmental advocacy group can keep its arm's length, but company monies can go to good things. I think it's got to be transparent, publicly disclosed, in order to be, for me to feel good about it. But other environmental groups, have different rules. And I really, one of our great partners is the Nature Conservancy. They've got different rules, but they've got a different mission. And I don't, not judging them. They're a great partner for EDF, and one we hope to work with more on climate change and other issues. By the way, I do want to say about Walmart that their announcement, they made a couple of huge announcements in September. One, that they were going to phase out 10 chemicals of concern from thousands, literally tens of thousands of their consumer products. And they've just written their suppliers about that in the last month. And that's huge. They're way ahead of the federal government or state governments. They've also asked people that supply their food products to optimize the use of fertilizer, which is, has the potential to be enormously good and cut some of the wasted fertilizer that's put on crops. So when they do good things, we feel free to compliment them. We've also, over time, pushed them to do more because they've got potential to do a lot of good stuff.
Nina.
I wanted to go back to your observation about environmental communication and the importance of environmentalists or people who care about the environment to really exercise their power at the ballot box. Here in North Carolina, a great example, when we poll on the environment, oftentimes environmental protection is after other in terms of what people care about, right? It's education and the economy and jobs and so on. However, when you drill down, sorry for the pun, on the issue, things change very markedly. For example, the Environmental Coalition in North Carolina has just been placing ads about the Duke issue, the coal ash issue. And in the two markets where we really pounded the issue, both in Greensboro and Raleigh, the administration's performance went down by 20 points. So communicating something very specific and doing an accountability campaign actually really had some traction. So I'd like for you, if you will, just to talk about environmental communications, sort of the big, sort of the broad communication versus really drilling down on something specific and how that changes public perception.
Well, it's my view, I know you're not asking the question, but since you mentioned the Duke coal ash situation, I have to say that I think the company needs to be held fully accountable by the governor and the policymakers here in North Carolina. And they should, fully clean up the Dan River. And coal ash should not be kept near surface waters and should be stored in places that are, well isolated from the environment. And we've been working at EDF hard to get EPA to put nationwide rules in place on coal ash. Having said all that, the general question that you're really asking, we have to, I think when we find ways to communicate the specifics in a way that touches people, they realize that this is going to impact them, their health, their country, their pocketbooks, depending on the issue. People are really receptive, and too often we're talking about, the planet in an abstract way. And so I don't, sit here today telling you that I know it all or that we've figured it all out. We've got a lot more to learn, especially about communication.
Jerry, could I, maybe we're going to try to close, we usually close about 6 o'clock, so this may be the last question. So if anybody's got an urgent last question after Jerry, I may or may not consider it.
Sound like a lawyer.
I want to congratulate Fred for that last answer. In Virginia, when we polled, we found out the more local the issue, the higher the proportion of interest in it would be. So that, to go back to the question of the electorate and making the environment, we were surprised to discover that, yes, communications is part of it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. On a statewide basis, there are other issues that matter more to the electorate, we found. But if you were to go to Danville, Virginia, and poll there, you'd probably, I suspect, find a lot of angst about the coal ash spill situation. So I just offer that as a consideration for you, is that the more local the problem, the more likely you are to get an environmentally informed electorate, and perhaps working literally from the grassroots up, local and higher, you might eventually elect more people to statewide and congressional offices. That
There's wisdom there.
Yeah. I think Nina's experience also is that the polling that they did there, focusing on the coal ash problem in the Dan River, had spillovers on statewide views with respect to the standing of the administration, with respect to how they've handled this problems. So it wasn't just the incidence of the change of policy, the change of attitudes was not just local, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Anybody want to make a closing statement? I want to make a closing statement. I think it's been absolutely stimulating discussion, just beautifully presented, lots of facts about the subject matter that Fred has been working on. And it's an extraordinary contribution to not to the American environment, to the way we should think about solving public policy problems. So I found it really inspiring. And I don't invite everybody who speaks here to come back, but I do invite you to come back again whenever we can work out a date. We can do it a year and a half ahead of time if we have to, but nonetheless, a really, really wonderful privilege to have you here. Very, very interesting. Let me